If a woman is accused of being unfaithful to her husband and goes through the soita process, which is very humiliating, and it turns out that she was innocent, there are great brachas that come her way. Now, Rashi only focuses on 2 of those brachas. The question is why. Soon Parashat Soita, Zok the Pasuk, at the end of Parashat Soita, Torah tells us, if the woman had not defiled herself with an inappropriate relationship, and therefore she's pure, then she will be cleansed and she will have children. So Rashi takes those words, that she'll have children, and interprets after telling us that v'niksa means she'll be cleansed of the bitter waters of the Sota. We'll talk about that later in the Sikha. But he tells us, what it means is, v'nizra zara means that if previously she had had very painful childbirths, then now she'll have easy childbirths. And if her children came out dark, they will now come out light. So it's very strange. The Makaf from the Pirish is in Sifri, Gemara Masechta Soita, V'Tesefta. There are multiple sources for this concept of the blessings that come to the woman if she's proven innocent in the Soita case. Besides the classic sources that we know, the Gemara, the Midrashim, it's also the Yerushalmi, the Medrash Tanchuma. On the alle Erete bringt sich noch inyone bracha. Every single one of those sources gives multiple blessings that come her way. Like, for example, in Nekeva, if she only had girls, she'll now have a boy. If her children came out unusually short, they'll come out at a decent length. Even some places say that if previously she had only had one child, now she'll have 2 children, or possibly even multiple births. If she battled to have children as often as she wanted to, and only had them every second year, now she'll be able to have a child annually. So many, many brachas, and the objective of this sikha is not to unpack the details of what those brachas are. Instead, our question is, why does Rashi take a different approach to all these other sources that give multiple brachas to this woman? Rashi only notes 2 of them, which are easier childbirth, and children who are of a lighter complexion. It's also interesting to note that the Rambam also only speaks to 2 of the brachas that could come to a woman, but not the same 2 as Rashi. Instead, the first he says is like Rashi, that she'll have easier childbirth, and then if she only ever had girls, she'll now have a boy or boys. So the question then is, why is Rashi picking out these 2 as if to say these are the major outcomes for the woman accused of infidelity who is proven through this humiliating sota process to be innocent? The only explanation we can give is, as al derech hapshat, if I'm taking the simplest understanding of the psukim, which is what Rashi does, as he himself tells us, my only intention here is to give you the easiest, simplest understanding of the pasuk. From pasuk no die 2 brachas was bringt must mean that out of all of the brachas, which are all valid, the only 2 that you could extract out of the words of the pasuk must be these 2: easy births and lighter complexions. To get to answer that, we have to address another big question. If you think about it, what Rashi is telling us doesn't seem like the pshat of what the Torah says. The Pirush HaPashut from Nizra Zora, the most direct translation of Nizra Zora is, as Eib Torah, that if she is proven innocent and pure, not only is she now exempt from the potential consequences of the sota, which is this whole collapse of her organs, but she'll have children. She will have children. And that's in fact how many of the pashtonim of the Chumash, like the Rashbam, the Ibn Ezra, that's how they understand it. That they're saying, as Hashem zera because she had this humiliating experience, the Eibishter will compensate her by giving her children. So Rashi, how is it possible then Rashi, whose entire focus is to tell us the simplest understanding of the psukim, as we've mentioned, interprets those words that she will produce seed, not in the most simple way to understand it, which is that she'll have children, but rather what the experience of that childbirth will be, or what types of children she'll have. How do you get that out of an Nizra Zora? So in Gemara Vasifri bringt sich a Plukta zwischen Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Shmuel. There's a debate that quoted both in the Gemara Soita and then the Sifri between Rabbi Shmuel and Rabbi Akiva. Maybe within that we'll have the answer to our question. Rabbi Akiva says that the Nixiv and Zara means Shimoisa Akora Nifkedes, that if she had been infertile, now she'll be blessed with children after the humiliating experience of the Soita. Zoktif then Rabbi Shmuel challenges him and says, Im Kain, if that's true, if this is now a cure for infertility, then any person who has battled infertility should go through a process that makes her husband suspect her of infidelity, then she'll have to have the soita water, and that will cure her of the infertility, right? So he says, so then how does Rabbi Shmuel explain this bracha that's going to come to her, that if she is okay and pure and didn't engage in inappropriate relations, that she will now have seed? What does it mean? He explains that if her pregnancies and her childbirth had been particularly painful, now she'll have relief from that. So therefore, some of the commentators on Rashi say, the reason Rashi is not going according to the Pshat, V'nizra Zora, which means she will have children, as Rabbi Akiva suggested, why not? Mitzad Kasha from Rabbi Shmuel, because Rabbi Shmuel had an issue with it. What was the issue that he had? That if this is a magic pill to cure infertility, then women who are battling infertility would go through the process. On the far, then Pirush from Rabbi Shmuel, which Lechera indicates that Rashi is going with the opinion of Rabbi Shmuel, which is not that we're going to have this as the solution to having children, but rather this is the solution to having easier childbirth, or, so to speak, more attractive children. But it's really, when you analyze it, quite a stretch to say that the reason Rashi has only picked these two possibilities of Benizra Zora because of Rabbi Shmuel's question, for a variety of reasons. Right? Azen and on the Pirush from Rabbi Shmuel, that Rashi is speaking the language of Rabbi Shmuel, taking the same perspective as Rabbi Shmuel. Why is this an issue? Varum, because, number one, this concern that Rabbi Shmuel had to Rabbi Akiva, if you believe that the Soita experience cures infertility, infertile women are going to try it, so it's not a big deal in Pshat. Number one, let's be honest, you can't voluntarily go and seclude yourself and then get the Soita process. No, the only time that the Soita process is even a thing is if the husband had warned her. So she's not in control of that. She can't voluntarily go and pretend to be inappropriate with somebody in the hope that she'll go through the Soita process. It's all dependent on her husband warning her, I don't want you hanging out with that person. Second of all, just let's say she did. Let's say that this woman did go through the Soita process. What's the big deal if one or even multiple infertile women go through the Soita process? Okay, so they do it. Big deal. What's Rabbi Akiva so worried about? We even have an opinion that says that that's what Chana wanted to do. She didn't have children. She wanted to go through the Soita process in order to have a child. Is it such a big gewalt that for that reason Rashi is going to go away from the Pshat of the Torah V'nizra Zora, as Rabbi Akiva challenged Rabbi Shmuel and say there's no way we could translate V'nizra Zora that she's going to have children, that this is a cure for infertility? What's the big Yishrei over here? Number two, base. Lidach, on the other hand, yes, there's a question to Rabbi Akiva. There's equally a question to Rabbi Shmuel. As Tosfos asks over there in the Gemara Soita, and he doesn't resolve it. What's the question? If a woman has very painful childbirth, let her also go through the Soita process, and then she'll have an easier time. And the commentators get into tremendous detail about this principle. So you're telling me Rashi will not interpret V'nizra Zora according to the simplest explanation because there's a question against Rabbi Akiva. So instead, he'll give an explanation that also has a similar question. And number three, Gimel, the Kashim Rabbi Shmuel is Im Kain. Listen carefully to what Rabbi Shmuel's challenge was. He said, if what you're saying is true, then he was challenging Rabbi Akiva, who's talking about a person who's infertile, who will now have children. Which means Rabbi Akiva is interpreting those words that she will have children only to refer to somebody who previously was unable to have children. Base, as the Tmi of Pirsh Rashi is al roiv tedaber, whereas our question is, why is Rashi not explaining B'nai Zara in the most obvious way, which is she will have children? And when we say somebody will have children, we usually refer to the majority. The majority of women are not infertile. So Favos is a nit mefarish. As B'nai Zara read, v'gen reiv nashim as isha harouya leidet. Why don't we just say very simply? The Torah over here is addressing the vast majority of women who could have children, and the bracha is now you will have a child. As in schar von ir kol yitna Hashem zera, that because she went through the humiliating process, that she'll have another child. Not that she never had a child, have another. Every child is a big bracha. Everybody understands that even if you have children, another child is a tremendous bracha in the house. So that's a good thing. Why do we have to automatically assume that we're talking about infertile people? Now we can go back to something we alluded to right at the beginning, another part of what Rashi says that doesn't seem to make absolute sense. So we have to understand Let's understand the beginning of Rashi's commentary where he addressed that word, v'niksa, that shall be cleansed. This is what he says. She'll be cleansed of those curse-filled waters. And that's not all. In addition to being cured of those waters, she will also have an additional bonus, which is that she'll have easier childbirth and nicer children. Let's think about this. What's Rashi telling us? That she'll be cleansed from that disturbing water. Surely that's self-understood. As das is the pirsha poshut fun veniksa. Isn't that what veniksa means? You'll be cleaned. It means there was something that was a stain, that was inappropriate, that was difficult, that was challenging. Is there mashpia? Go back. Before all this process begins, the kohen makes her take an oath. And in that oath, he tells her, if you were not guilty of what's being accused, then hinoki mi mei amorim ameorim ha'ele. You will be clean from these bitter, cursed waters. What does Rashi have to say? So if it turns out that she's innocent, she'll be cleaned of the water. Well, the Torah already said that. So the Rabbi learned, as Rashi Bavon dermit, the Rabbi wants to suggest that Rashi is illustrating, don't read the word v'niksa as running into the fact that v'nizra zara. In other words, there's mashma from Pashas l'sheina posuk as v'nizra zara is atitzof from v'niksa. Don't just take this posuk at face value where her having children is the result of her being cleansed. And the pshat from posuk is v'niksa midvarim hamoinim haleido v'zen izra zara. So in other words, you shouldn't think that there was some kind of an impediment for her against her having children. That has now been cleansed, removed, deleted, and now she's going to have children. Rashi immediately rejects us and says, first thing you have to know, v'niksa means she has now been pardoned from the horrible physical consequences that the Mayim Hamorim could bring. And then over and above that, she'll have children. Two things are happening over here. Not because we've removed an impediment, now she naturally has children. No, we're removing the punishment, and in addition, she'll have children. That's how the Re'im explains it. But it's not so simple. Number one, Aleph. The Re'im is saying you might have thought V'niksa means that it's the removal of impediments to having children. V'niksa doesn't fit that. V'niksa means to be cleansed. From fear. Not like she had an impediment, a problem, a physical, biological issue against having children. Now it's removed. The word for that's not v'niksa, it's v'nimsara, I don't know, v'nifsaka, something like that. The pasuk dav should have said she should be cured. Number two, base void v'ikar. We can go on a kosal gedaiter to teitchen. How can anybody, even in their wildest dreams, imagine that v'niksa means removing impediments to having a child? Because if that's what you're saying, then go back to what the Kohen told in his preamble. You're going to be cleansed from these waters. So he made her that promise. If you're pure, you'll be cleansed from these waters. And now you're telling me when it actually comes to fruition, it's not really being cleansed from the waters, it's being cleansed from some biological defect that you had that you couldn't have children. How do you add that up? So the Re'im's explanation of Rashi doesn't sit tight with us. Similarly, the Gur the Maral's explanation, also seems to be lacking. Where he says Rashi wants to be clear that we shouldn't misinterpret the word v'niksa as being cleansed of an avera, like we use the expression v'nikah ha'ish me'oven. In other words, it's cleansed from the water, not from the effects of the water, not from an avera. Again, the pasuk said very clearly beforehand that you'll be cleansed from these waters. So where would be the logic to say we already have the word hinaki and it means you'll be cleansed from the water because the Torah said hinaki mi me'amorim oile. Now you come along, you say v'niksa means something else. Not that you cleanse from the water, you cleanse from the avera. Doesn't seem to make sense. So back to square one. Why is Rashi saying v'niksa mimayim ha'ma'orim if the pasuk already told it to us? The explanation is Rashi has a very simple issue that arises from your simple understanding of the pasuk that he needs to address. When the Kohen went through the process with the woman and told her this is what's going to happen if things are bad, this is what's going to happen if things are good, so surely he would have explained all of the relevant details. All of them, right? Which means, he explains everything that's going to happen if she's innocent, and chas v'shalom the opposite. When the pasuk read wegen die Titzos before, so how could it be? He gives her all of the details of what's going to happen, but then when the Torah describes what actually happens, it adds a detail. When talks suddenly about having children. He never said a word about having children. It's not something that was pre-included in the oath that he made her take. So that's Rashi's question. How come the Kohen goes through every single detail, but then when the story actually happens, we discover a detail the Kohen did not mention? To address this question is Rashi matik v'niksa. Rashi quotes the word v'niksa und sagt. V'niksa, she's cleansed, means mi mayim amorim, from the curse-filled waters. Ve'loi oid, not only that, which the Kohen already told her, ella, but that means something even more happens to her, that she can now have children. Or easier childbirth, as he says. So what's Rashi emphasizing here? The Torah is not just talking about over here generically that she gets the benefit of another reward, i.e. easier childbirth. Like we saw in other sources, that because she was so terribly embarrassed, we're going to give her a compensation prize. You'll have a child. No, Rashi is completely adjusting our perspective that we should realize. So she's cleansed from the water, and even more than that, from the water comes this bracha of easy childbirth. In others, Rashi is identifying not only would these waters, which potentially could cause such devastation to a person, in the case of her innocence, not cause that devastation, as the curse element will be removed. Not only is it not negative, but more than that, this same water that originally was called me'arim from the word curse is actually now going to be water of bracha. What bracha? Therefore, Rashi puts together v'niksa mi mayim amorim. She's cleansed from that water. Not because he thinks you might have misinterpreted the word v'niksa to mean that she is cleansed of a biological issue that caused infertility, or cleansed from an avera. No, that's not what Rashi is addressing. Nor it's a madig. Rather, Rashi is emphasizing the fact that there's bracha in her life now associated with fertility is a result of that water. Which means, as Rashi is innovating that this bracha of what's going to happen with her fertility, with her childbirthing in the future, is directly related to this water. So now we've removed the problem of how come the Kohen didn't tell her about this. But the Kohen sagt to me because the Kohen was speaking in general terms. If you're innocent, you'll be clean of any of the negative effects of this water. Und dennoch ist der Pasuk mefort as the hinokim mimei amorim is Chelek dem Prat von Bnei Zora. And then the Pasuk says, what does cleansed mean? I'll tell you. It also means that there'll be a bracha. What's the bracha of Bnei Zora? Apikol zeh. That also explains why Rashi does not explain Bnei Zora means now she will have a child, but rather easier childbirth, more attractive children. But about like Rashi is the Bnei Zora piula fundi mayim hame'orim. Seeing as Rashi's shita is what causes this new experience of children, the waters. That the water which was going to cause her physical devastation is now doing the opposite. If it's the same water that's giving her bracha in place of curse, logic dictates that the bracha should be the antithesis of those curses. In other words, it's not just that this was some kind of a poison that if she drank and was guilty, it would chas v'shalom take her out. Rashi explained that's what ma'orim means, that it removes a person from the world. The Torah was specific. It will be a torturous death through all this organ collapse. So if that's how the negative will be, so naturally, logically, we say the opposite effect of the same water when it brings her bracha. It can't just be generic, you'll have a child. Now, the even fun is it has to be that you'll have a child in a way that is the opposite of pain. The negative side of this water is to create excruciating pain. So the positive side of this water has to be to alleviate pain. If previously she had painful childbirth, now it will be easy. But er see moise lede schreine lede levonim bin gut der schachus upon was is bringing these surim from tzavs a bit navat benaf the yerecha. That's also why he specifies this idea of the complexion of the child, because we're told that as the process of the soita water, if it was negative, would happen, would darken her face. So the opposite, the bracha, has to be to lighten the face of the person. Mashenkin down there in Yom Chazal bringen, whereas all the other brachas that are brought in the Medrash and in the Gemara, etc. That she, instead of girls, would have boys. That children would come out long. That she'll have more children at a time, or more frequently have children. That would have no relation to being the opposite of the curse of these waters. These are just generic brachas. Therefore, Rashi doesn't quote them. So Dainin, as the Bnei Zora, is not stam maschar. So now Rashi's perspective, which is that the bracha associated with children is not generic, but rather not itself and the Maimon Morim Atzmam. It's a direct result of the same water that could have killed her in the most terrible way. Teaches us something aligned with the deeper meaning of Soita, which is about our relationship with Hashem. Right at the beginning of this section, the pasuk says, "Ish ki siste ishtoi," where a man whose wife is off the derech, inappropriate. So in Chazal, the Gemara there tells us straight away, "Ein adam avera," and in Kenichnas by Rosh Shtus, that a person would never do any avera unless they had temporary insanity. Thus haste. As in Aseit is merames of the Rosh Shtus v'chagit efsharius and his gerim as the adam zal sein an over avera. So yes, we're talking about a very specific case of a woman being unfaithful potentially to her husband. Yet the Gemara says it is representative of every time we do an avera, which, if you think about it, is an act of infidelity towards Hashem. So this whole idea of warning the wife and then she goes and is secluded with somebody else has a spiritual component as well, which is when a Jew hides, which means he turns his back on Hashem. The ish from Knesset Yisrael, because Hashem is the husband in our relationship. Even though right, he said, I don't want you there. Don't go there. Don't be with this person. That's what the husband says to the woman in the Soita story. That's what the Eibusha tells us. Don't go into those places. Don't have other gods. And if a person goes and secludes themselves, in other words, enters into an intimate space with their own Yetzer Hara, that is like a Soita. It's in from Bnei Zora. So if there's the possibility that the end result of that kind of infidelity towards God should be having children, that means if the person in Nixor did tshuva. Not only does tshuva cleanse the stain of the avera that a person did, but if a person does tshuva, that elevates the individual even higher than they were before they messed up in the first place. As the famous saying, that the level at which a Baal tshuva stands is a level beyond which a tzaddik could stand. And Rashi is talking exactly that language if you take a deeper perspective of Rashi. As the Zora, the aliyah shel tshuva, this idea of being able to be productive, to be fertile, which is represented by tshuva, isn't it stam zaitikin? It's not like a sidebar. Okay, there could have been a terrible consequence, but Baruch Hashem, it didn't work out that way. Rather, Rashi says the fertility comes from the same water that threatened her. The aliyah is verbunden damit, was die Maim Amorim Gufo is mehapech letoiv, which represents in spiritual terms, why is a person elevated? Because they transformed into positive their negative behavior. They turned the bitter taste into a sweet taste. As the Gemara tells us, when a person does proper tshuva, their averos become their credits, they become their merits. So the same thing, the water becomes the source of the bracha. And thus the tam pnimi from Parsha, which would explain why the promise of the fertility or the ease of birth is only told at the end of the Sota story. And it's come to when things actually come to happen, not in the oath that was administered by the Kohen. Because the principle that having gone through the horrific experience of an Avera, which is so spiritually demeaning, the fact that you could come out on the other side higher and greater, is not something that you could even discuss before the person has done tshuva. Until a person has done tshuva, to take the attitude which says, I'll sin now and do tshuva later, we know that itself blocks the person from the opportunity to do tshuva. So you can't say it as part of the shvur, you can't say it as part of the preamble. You cannot do an avera with the expectation that later it will give me this wonderful opportunity for tshuva. It's only when the tshuva actually happened, like in our story of the Sota. It's when we've actually tested her with the water and she's innocent. Then you could see what was the intention behind this whole experience. Not only that you should be clean and pure as you were before the Avera happened, but that this should be a time of productivity. That everything is greater than it was, easier than it was, clearer than it was. That's what levanim means, right? That's something which is clear. Also alludes to the idea that an avera is compared to red, and tshuva, which cleanses the avera, is compared to white. And when we do tshuva, the Eibishter redeems us immediately. As tomorrow's Tzarbi Surim von Chevle Mashiach Veret Revach, instead of the pangs of childbirth that we are experiencing in the run up to Mashiach, which can be incredibly painful, we'll have, like the promise to the Sota, we'll have ease. And instead of the darkened faces, as the Gemara describes us, like the blackened pot, because of the difficulties of Golus, Vet Levanim, the Eir HaGeula will be light and bright and white, reflecting the light of Geula. And all of those promises of that ease and of that brightness can happen even before Mashiach comes in the letzter going from Golus, while we're still in the very last moments of Golus. So we'll have an experience which is similar, as the Pasuk promises us, to the experience of Yetzias Mitzrayim, where even before they left Mitzrayim, the real pain and subjugation of the Golus already fizzled out and suspended once the Makkos began. And we know in Makas Choshech, the Jewish people had light when the rest of the world was dark. That could be the same thing for us, even before Mashiach comes. And we'll go in a very pleasant, easy, comfortable way in order to be able to greet Mashiach, which should happen immediately now.